I would say ultimately the CIO role isn't a technology role. It's a role about motivating people to do the right things at the right times within the right constraints.
Welcome to the operating system. I'm Andy Milkowski. This show is for people who are running complex operations, who don't necessarily have time for theory, but want to know what those operating at the highest levels, what it actually is working for them. So whether you're running an imaging center, leading a radiology department, or optimizing a complex operation, we seek to uncover what separates good from the truly exceptional. On that note, I want to introduce today's guest, Dr. Lee Milligan. He's a physician who became a programmer and then a CIO. He spent 22 years at Asante Health System in Oregon, starting as an attending ER doc and eventually becoming Senior VP and Chief Information Officer. After Asante, he was a CIO at SimonMed Imaging, one of the largest outpatient imaging providers in the country, where he dramatically reduced X-ray turnaround time by something like 36 hours. Now he runs Asbury Health Tech Partners, where he takes his experience to help other healthcare organizations navigate technology decisions without getting taken down the wrong path. Lee, thanks for being here.
Good morning, Andy. Good to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So you trained as an ER doc, first at UCLA and then later at Asante Health. Most people that start there don't end up as a CIO.
Fair to say. There's a fairly small club of MDs who are also CIOs, and I was very happy to be a part of that club for a period of time.
I think the story starts with some 5 code blues in one evening. Maybe you could take us down.
Yeah, so there was a number of events that occurred while I was a practicing emergency physician that made me realize that at some point I wanted to perhaps work on the system, not just in the system. And I realized that there were some structural elements that sometimes don't line up with providers, physicians, nurses being able to bring their best. I had one occasion where I was working in the ER. It's about 2 a.m, and I had a patient come in, a stabbing victim, and I needed a special tool, a rib spreader tool. And the team that had put that together after they had sterilized it put it together incorrectly. Ultimately, we got it back together and able to move forward with the procedure, but it really disturbed me that that was even possible in the process. For that specific scenario, I ended up going downstairs and talking to the manager, and ultimately, I took a picture of what it should look like. Now, I'm going to date myself here a little bit. Went to Walmart and put my SD card in and printed out a picture and gave it to him. And he put it up in the area where they put together the tools. Ultimately, that led to an idea where he took pictures of everything of how it should look and put it into a book. And that ultimately changed how that was delivered. And that was one of my first aha moments around you can really work on changing the system for the better and everybody benefits. The CodeRunner situation was interesting. In a typical hospital, the team in the ER responds to codes when they happen. So a code blue, somebody is in the hospital, they're post-surgery or they're waiting for a procedure or whatnot. And a number of times they can go into cardiac arrest or respiratory arrest, one of the two. And when that happens, it can be a very confusing time for folks. Everybody's kind of scrambling, trying to help out best they can. And when you arrive to help as the ER doc, frequently you don't have a lot of information that you need. The CodeRunner situation was interesting because we had just gone on to Epic, and I had become an Epic analyst. I went down the physician builder road, learned how to program our instance of Epic. And I had this kind of aha moment after I had a particular shift where for some reason there were 5 code blues on that particular shift. Usually you get 1, maybe none. So I went home, had a tall glass of wine and went to sleep, got up the next day and had this aha moment that a lot of the information that we need in order to be able to properly assess and resuscitate a patient is actually in the record. It's just in disparate locations. So one thing I really wanted to focus on was for all the folks who experience cardiac arrest, it turns out there's a finite number of reasons that are actually reversible. And so my thought process was if I could just identify those 14 things, have it be specific to the patient, and then bring all that information to one single page. I got out of the shower after having the aha moment. My wife was kind enough to sketch it out for me, actually wireframe it. I still have it today. And then I went to work on building this out. It took me about 6 months, but ultimately we were able to launch it, teach it, train it. And then ultimately it was picked up by Epic. I actually met with the Epic senior leadership team and Judy Faulkner, and we talked through it. And now it's in the foundation system for Epic. It's a yellow button. So when somebody goes into cardiac arrest, the resuscitation screen comes up. You click that one button, and you can easily see, maybe 20 seconds, you can quickly identify if there's actually a reversible reason why that individual experienced cardiac arrest. So again, going back to the theme of working on the system, not just in the system, that was really an important moment for me.
And perhaps this is off the topic, but I find it ironic that a code blue is represented with a yellow button.
That's a good point.
One of the interesting items that you brought up is you already started in the physician's kind of program for learning how to program within Epic. Was there a particular motivation inside there? Because that seems to have prompted kind of this epiphany later.
At the time, my brother Mark, who's also a physician, was on the board of directors for Intermountain Healthcare, and we had a lot of discussions around some of the big changes that were happening in healthcare. This is going back to 2008. So Obama's coming in. There's a lot of talk about ARRA and ACA, and ultimately the High Tech Act and something called meaningful use, which was where the government essentially set aside about $80 billion to assist hospitals and doctors to convert from a paper-based system to a digital system. And so it was pretty clear to me that all this money was about to be infused, a ton of technology was about to be dumped on doctors and nurses. And it was also clear to me that there was going to be a train wreck, that it wasn't going to really match what ultimately was needed. And so at that point, I actually went back to school to begin to learn how to program computers. And it was in the middle of that when our hospital began the selection process for a new electronic health record. And I got pulled into that. I think I took 2 steps backwards and everybody else took 10 steps backwards. And somehow I was voluntold to be part of the process. And I'm so glad I did, because it was a career-changing move for me. And I do feel like having physicians involved in the process definitely ultimately delivers a better product.
Yeah, I think you're hitting upon something that resonated with me when you talk about having the physicians involved, because the yellow button would have never really happened, because otherwise it would have taken who and how to write the system specifications in order to be translated for some programmer to do it. Unless you were personally involved and had that insight and were able to do it, you could see that almost never happening.
That's a great point. I can give you a good example of that. So when I was building this out, I got stuck on one element for CodeRunner specifically. One of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to have a list of the medications that the person has received only within the last 2 hours prior to the arrest. And because one of the challenges with electronic health records is there's so much noise and very little signal. And in particular, during a resuscitation scenario, when tensions are high, emotions are running high, it's very easy to get pulled into the noise. And so my goal of CodeRunner really was to extract the noise and have only pure signal. And when I tried to describe what I was looking to accomplish, all of the analysts I was working with, who I was asking their advice on various ways to do this, none of them understood why I would only want the last 2 hours. They wanted to bring everything in that the patient had ever received during their entire stay. And there was just no comprehension of why it would matter until I finally literally whiteboarded out what the goal was with a small team. And ultimately, we were able to get there. But yes, I think not having a person who's actually doing the work be part of the process really leaves you with a product that doesn't meet your needs.
I wonder, in your later experiences, are there more CodeRunner opportunities in the world?
Yeah, I think so long as the specific operational and clinical workflow is at the heart of what you're trying to accomplish. You start there, and then you work backwards towards the technology of what you're trying to accomplish. Frequently, electronic health record vendors, they really want to showcase all of their features, which I get, but at the end of the day, the doc is just trying to do their job. And the technology will either get in their way of doing their job, or it will augment and amplify doing their job. So I think for any specific task, if the electronic health record can be configured in a way where all the buttons that are available to the clinician meet the needs of that task, and all the other ones are either in the background or not visible at all, then you've really got to another level.
So let me shift gears a little bit into other things that you've covered in other backgrounds, specifically regarding prioritization and project management.
Yes.
And one of the things you've known for saying is that project management in healthcare is behind most industries and perhaps missing business objectives. On the other hand, all of us see IT teams being burned out. So when you came in as CIO, both Asante and SimonMed, how did you approach this prioritization of projects?
Yeah, that's so true. And I think part of it is because there's a healthcare mission that kind of trumps everything else. And sometimes that leads folks to not apply business principles to what needs to be applied. So, for example, you might have a project that might seem like a nice idea in a vacuum, but ultimately the numbers don't add up, or it impedes operational workflow. It might be a compliance issue. And even if it is going to be positive from a healthcare perspective, we have to quantify that positive impact, because the teams, there's finite energy and time within a cohort of project managers and the rest of the folks who are participating in the projects. You have to be able to say, out of all these great ideas, which ones will deliver the most value for our patients and for our bottom line? Because ultimately, no margin, no mission. And so one of the first things I did at both SimonMed and Asante is I lined up all the projects that were in flight, and I worked with the team to develop a weighted scoring tool to be able to apply some level of objectivity to the process of thinking through this. And then ultimately, we hard ranked everything. We also added up all of the hours available with project management and additional ancillary staff that need to be involved in the process. And we recognized that there was a disconnect between what everybody wanted to get done and what was possible to get done. And so at that point, we pulled together a very thoughtful team to be able to go through it and identify which ones are current and which ones really need to be on the back burner until some space opens up.
In those discussions, you talk about project managers like your IT staff, but I imagine the first round of prioritization has to come from the executive team, and you have a forced ranking with them, the finances, the financial officers, the executive officers, and that.
Yes, correct. And really, you can't do any of this without their full and complete, not just buy-in, but true support in rooms where you're not present. And so you really have to explain the challenge and also the value of doing it this way. It feels good to say, let's lob one more project over the wall so somebody's working on it. But the reality is there's a dilution effect that occurs. It also takes the winds out of folks' sails if they're really being expected to do way more than what's even possible. And so you have to have that conversation where you're not just talking about throwing extra stuff on the plate, because the goal isn't more projects. The goal is value extraction. So how quickly, what's our speed to value extraction? And so when we recognize the dilution effect can slow down the speed to value, then there's a recognition that it's important to do this process.
In my experiences, I always thought about ranking projects, but also from if there was any opportunities to rank projects in multifactorial ways that you could extract the greatest benefit because you're leveraging people in unique ways, right? Rather than having everybody work on just one project at a time where you may be underutilizing other people in the organization.
You have to kind of match folks' expertise and skill sets with the work that needs to be done. You can easily have a great project manager have a mediocre performance if there isn't thought given to how that's matched up.
Were there any other kind of takeaways in your time at Asante, accomplishments that have to be done in order to run a good organization, maybe on the uptime, on security, those items that could ultimately help in project management?
Yeah, so a number of things come to mind, but the first thing that comes to mind is the financial element. If you come in as a CIO, you will immediately be scrutinized. There'll be a presumption that you're wasting money, and frequently there is a lot of waste. And there'll be a presumption that you are not a good steward of the allocated funds. If you look at the expenditure for IT within a healthcare organization, and you put that as a numerator, and the denominator is the total annual revenue, that percentage ends up being someplace between 4 and 6%, depending on where you're at and what you're doing. And that number is growing consistently. And so one of the first things I did was I sat down with both the CEO and CFO, and I asked them, purely from a financial perspective, how do I achieve success? Give me one metric. And ultimately, I put forward just that fraction, right? What's the IT spend over total operational spend? I then went through line by line our expenditures, and I identified there were a number of expenditures that were allocated to IT that really weren't IT. So then I had to define what is an IT operating expense and what is a departmental expense. And that took a few months to get people on board with a proper definition for that. And then I went looking for the contracts. And what I found was the contracts were all over the place. They were in, individual file cabinets. They were in various individual hard drives. Sometimes they were network drives. And so I got my team together and we built a spreadsheet, just a simple spreadsheet that identified each of the individual contracts that exist within IT. I assigned a manager over individual contracts. So there was a point person between myself and them. And actually it was a teaching opportunity because I got a chance to teach the managers and the directors how to read a contract, how to think through it, how to identify red flags, right? And so ultimately at the end, we had this beautiful spreadsheet that was sortable by manager that identified all of the current contracts. You could sort it by different categories of expenditure. And additionally, we set a reminder that went to the manager 3 months before the expiration for the renewal. And that allowed the manager to ask really good questions. We baked these questions actually into the spreadsheet. So the first question was, do we even still use this product? Number 2, does this product overlap with any other product? Are we dual paying here? 3, have they been charging us appropriately, whether their charges are by monthly, quarterly, yearly, whether it's by volume, whether it's just, licensed users, concurrent users, et cetera. And so we had ultimately eight questions that were asked every time before renewal. And it was done early enough so that if we wanted to pivot to a different vendor, that was on the table. So that put us in a very good negotiating position. And at the end, I actually presented this to our executive team and our board to showcase the stewardship that was happening within Asante. And when I started there, our expenditure was 5.1%. And when I left, it was 4.3%. However, we brought way more products and services by the time I left than when I started.
Wow. Let's pivot over your time at SimonMed and perhaps some accomplishments there. I believe one of the stories that you've talked about is when you arrived, you asked the radiologist a simple question. Out of all the modalities that you read, which one do you hate the most? Can you talk about that scenario?
Yes, I was fortunate to work with a number of awesome clinicians there, radiologists, subspecialty radiologists, which is really a terrific opportunity for me to learn from them. And when we would meet, we would talk about random things. But at one point, I recognized that there was a tendency to game the system a bit when it came to the work queue. And I kind of knew what the answer was going to be, but I asked it anyways, just to, get not only the answer, but also their thoughts behind it. So I asked the question you just stated, what modality? Is it MRI? Is it CT? Is it ultrasound? Is it DEXA? What is it you don't like reading? And it was a universal chant. It was X-ray. And I was a little puzzled with that because, I've been reading X-rays for 20 years and it just struck me as odd. And they said, look, we get paid nothing for the X-ray, basically $7 or whatever it might be. And yet the risk is high. And the reason the risk is high is because the technology is old and it's 2-dimensional. And you're basically looking for shadows versus CT scan, which can give you a 3-dimensional picture. You can do 3D reconstructions. You can look around corners. Same with MRI, even ultrasound, because you can look at the same organ from different angles, right? And so their thought was high risk, low reward. What's not to love? And so at the time, we were looking at a number of types of AI products to continue to implement within the organization. And we ultimately selected a company called AZMed out of Paris. Julian, their CEO, is awesome to work with. And at the time, their product wasn't fully baked. And so we were doing a bit of co-development with them. And essentially, they were very receptive to our feedback. So we implemented it. It took a long time. Individual integrations for AI products on top of a PACS system, which is the software used to bring up the pictures and look at them, can take a long time. And that's why these new marketplaces have erupted, like Carpal and VizAI and a few others, specific to this, so they can take that pain off your plate. But anyways, we got this in place, and we turned it on. And mind you, this is a large organization. This is 400 plus radiologists spread across the country. And the work queues can typically be 15, 18,000. Sometimes it can spike to 30,000 studies that need to be read at any given time. And our X-ray turnaround times were not great. We turned this on, and within 2 weeks, our turnaround times for long bone X-rays, that's where we started, long bone X-rays, decreased by 36 hours. Hard number, 36 hours. And what the docs told me was, hey, if it's already read, then I'm just more willing, I'm more inclined to just grab it, take a look at it, just make sure it's not missing something, and then move on. And it took the sting out of pulling that X-ray off the queue. And that was a real benefit to the patients, and it was good for business as well, because it's a volume-based business. And so the more you do, the more you get paid. So it's good for the patient, and it's good for the bottom line.
Do you think that experience you had at SimonMed in implementing AI for X-rays to help reduce turnaround time, do you think that's a generalized learning for any imaging center?
Yes, I do. And I think, honestly, every imaging center in the country is going to have to ultimately adopt some level of AI. And they can be selective about what that looks like. They don't have to take all AI right now, but they're going to have to be thoughtful and selective about how they improve the efficiency of their staff. That's a constant challenge. And also the accuracy of their reads. And so I feel like moving forward, what were nice to haves previously are going to become more and more standard operating procedure and an expectation. I'll give you one example. So in a large hospital system, they also might have very deep queues. And within those queues, there may be, a head CT or belly CT or whatever it might be. There's technology out now that you can set it specific to head CT, for example, to look for an acute stroke or a bleed. And it could run through the entire queue without a human being involved at all. Identify, number 18,450 has a head bleed, an emergency, an acute finding, and bring that to the top. That was a nice to have 2 years ago. It's becoming more and more the standard of care. And now you might ask the question from a litigation perspective, somebody does have a bleed in the brain and there is a 3-hour delay and that leads to a bad outcome. And that technology would have identified it, recognized it earlier, treated earlier, can ask the question, what's the standard of care?
Oh, yeah. And from your SimonMed kind of experience where the preferential picking of exams was, you were avoiding the low RVU kind of things that perhaps the AI opportunities or optimization opportunities, biggest opportunities lie with those lower RVUs, less likely to be picked exams.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work being done on creating work queues that are really well constructed and learn from a variety of different scenarios of how to ultimately assign different studies. And so there's a lot of work happening on that front. One of my friends, Omar Al-Musa, radiologist out of Pittsburgh, designed to avoid the cherry picking, but at the same time, load balance so that folks are appropriately distributed what makes sense, not just from a productivity perspective, but from a humanistic perspective of being able to handle what's being put on your plate.
We started this most recent kind of conversation over you asking radiologists what modality they hate the most. Mm-hmm. You also have talked about in the past at SimonMed about the fax machine story. So before you go into that fax machine story, I'm always interested in how did you know to ask the question that led you to the fax machine story?
So I was looking at our numbers of studies that we perform. And this is something that we go over, that when I was at SimonMed, we went over on a weekly basis. So you could see these numbers and see where they're going. And we were adding sites and we were adding a number of additional inputs to our system and making connections with additional referring doctors. Dr. Simon was excellent at building relationships with referring doctors, and he was very kind of concierge oriented. And so he was doing a great job with that. And I just started scratching my head that the numbers in my mind should have been higher, right? Based on the trajectory and the acquisitions and these fantastic relationships, I would have thought the trajectory would have been extrapolating where we were to where I thought we should go. My thought was that really should be higher. And so I like asking dumb questions because it often gets people to think about things differently. So I asked, how do we get our orders? Like, how do they come in? Are they all EHR? Now, at the time, you have to understand, I had previously been at Asante. And so most of the orders came in through the electronic health record. But it turns out for ambulatory imaging or telehealth, many of those frequently come in by fax. So I asked, what's the number for the fax? And it was, many thousands. So then I asked, are there any constraints on the orders coming in? And it turned out that each channel could handle a certain number. And if you looked, we pulled the actual fax channel data, they were topped out, totally topped out. And so that led to a further discussion, and we'd have a weekly finance meeting where we talk about either emergent or additional expenditures that need to occur. I was a freaking guest asking for things. And so I asked for additional fax channels, and I made the analogy. I said, look, we've got a great burger joint, right? And we've got 8 doors, but it turns out 4 of those doors don't work. And they're not selecting the other doors because there's no room. They can't fit in that line. So they're just waiting at the door. Okay, I want to sell more burgers. So it passed.
That was probably the best ROI of any expenditure. Huh?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And they're going to go elsewhere if they can't get their order in. The other key thing is you might lose referring providers for life, right? If they get constantly frustrated with a scenario, it's not just a one-off diversion. They're going to say, time out. When I send patients there, I can't get them to get the order. That's a problem.
Agreed. So I like to close out a interview with a series of rapid fire questions. Okay. Are you ready?
Hit me.
All right. So start out. What's the biggest misconception about healthcare IT?
I would say when you call the help desk, there's a presumption that the individual on the other side of the line has the answer and is keeping it from you. And the reality is many of these folks are awesome human beings who do the best they can with very complicated, multi-layered scenarios. And the vast majority are really trying to help you within their constraints. And so I would say that, my dad used to say the vinegar or honey attracts flies better. So either way, apply some honey, be nice to the person you're talking to, and you will get a lot further during the conversation.
Wow. Well said. So what's one thing that every imaging CIO should prioritize?
Can I give you 2?
All right, let's do it.
Number 1, you have to be a good steward, a great steward of the financial allocations. And then you have to showcase that you are a great steward of those funds. So people recognize not only your competence, but your trustworthiness to navigate those funds correctly. That's number 1. Number 2, I would say, is you got to get ahead of the AI ball. You got to get ahead of it now. I do not believe in one-off integrations. I think you have to pick your AI marketplace, or what I call the AI enabling layer, to partner with and align that with what your organization is looking to accomplish. Otherwise, you'll just kill your teams. I got to give you a third one. Sorry. And the third is you got to get ahead of prioritization. Put a structure in place so that there is sanity within your teams.
Yeah, wise words. Sounds like somebody who's gone through this a couple of times.
Got a few scars.
What's the first thing you look at when you walk into a new organization?
I look for the true leaders who don't hold a title. Every organization has them. You know who they are. They're well respected. They're smart. They have certain connections, and they can make or break you, usually when you're not in the room. Identifying who those folks are and making an effort to understand them and their perspective and build a relationship with them pays huge dividends.
Excellent. So being that you're of a very select group of physicians as CIOs, what's the hardest part of being a physician in a CIO role?
I actually think it's a ridiculous advantage. I think it's an advantage that is like, it almost feels unfair sometimes, because you have a level of understanding of what you're trying to accomplish that folks without a clinical background may not have. If you are a decent clinician, you don't have to be a star. If you're a decent clinician, then immediately your most vocal critics will extend some level of grace. In my case, when I was at Asante, a lot of these folks who otherwise would have hurled something at me, I've been in the ER with them at 3 a.m. up to my ankles in blood with them. And you can't do that to somebody who you have that kind of relationship with. And so I would say it's a huge advantage. There's always naysayers that are out there, but I would say ultimately the CIO role isn't a technology role. It's a role about motivating people to do the right things at the right times within the right constraints. Ultimately, that can be somebody from any walk of life, but particularly within healthcare, an MD or an RN, or really any role that you've had. You don't have to be an MD or an RN. Any role you had in the delivery of care will give you a distinct advantage.
So maybe this last question builds off of that one. How about defining operational excellence in one sentence?
I'm going to go back to a medical analogy, if that's okay. Back, many years ago, when we would define shock, so somebody's been in a car accident or a stabbing or a gunshot wound, or maybe they have a bad infection, they go into shock. We used to define that via a blood pressure. We'd say when the blood pressure is less than 80 systolic, then they're in shock. But later on, a better definition came out, which was if you are not perfusing your organs, if the blood pressure isn't high enough to actually push blood into your kidneys, into your liver, into your heart, to your lungs, all that, that's the true definition of shock. And I would say it's the same thing with the CIO role within health systems. You can't define it by a certain number of projects that you've accomplished, but if you are ultimately not a hindrance, but actually meeting the needs of the strategic initiatives that your organization is pushing forward, and you're keeping pace with where they are going, then you're successful in that role.
Oh, that's fantastic. So Lee, you've obviously shared quite a number of insights, I guess, that you've gathered over the years. So for folks that want to connect with you and maybe learn a little bit more about Asbury Health Tech Partners, where should they go? Yeah,
the website is asburyhealthtech.com, all one word, and ASBURY, and that's healthtech, TECH.com. Or you can even just email me, Lee Milligan, at asburyhealth.com. And love to have a conversation with you. Our company really focuses on helping hospital health systems, ambulatory imaging, telehealth, and even investors make better decisions in this space. It's a very crowded, noisy, sometimes fictitious space. And so I have a very deep bench of individuals who are true experts in this space. We like to help people make better decisions and to implement with precision. I liken it to Princess Bride when Buttercup is being led through the fire swamp by Wesley. I like to think of us as Wesley because it is a fire swamp out there.
Excellent. Lee, this has been great. You've shown a lot of successful experience, real insights from someone who's been in the room making it happen. So I appreciate you being here.
Thanks very much, Andy. I really appreciate it.
And for everyone else listening, if you've got something out of this conversation, subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts and connect with me at LinkedIn. I'm Andy Milkowski. This is the Operating System, and see you next time.